Adolf Hitler's rise to power began in Germany in September 1919 when Hitler joined the political party known as the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei (DAP). The name was changed in 1920 to the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei (NSDAP). This political party was formed and developed during the post-World War I era. It was anti-Marxist and was opposed to the democratic post-war government of the Weimar Republic and the Treaty of Versailles. And it advocated extreme nationalism and Pan-Germanism as well as virulent anti-Semitism. Hitler's rise can be considered to have ended in March 1933, after the Reichstag adopted the Enabling Act of 1933 in that month. President Paul von Hindenburg had already appointed Hitler as Chancellor on January 30, 1933 after a series of parliamentary elections and associated backroom intrigues. The Enabling Act when used ruthlessly and with authority virtually assured that Hitler could thereafter constitutionally exercise dictatorial power without legal objection. Adolf Hitler rose to a place of prominence in the early years of the party. Being one of the best speakers of the party, he told the other members of the party to either make him leader of the party or he would never return. He was aided in part by his willingness to use violence in advancing his political objectives and to recruit party members who were willing to do the same. The beer hall putsch in November 1923 and the later release of his book Mein Kampf introduced Hitler to a wider audience. In the mid-1920s, the party engaged in electoral battles in which Hitler participated as a speaker and organizer, as well as in street battles and violence between the Rotfront-Konkurrenzbund and the Nazis Sturmatialung. Through the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Nazis gathered enough electoral support to become the largest political party in the Reichstag, and Hitler's blend of political acuity, deceptiveness and cunning converted the party's non-majority but plurality status into effective governing power in the ailing Weimar Republic of 1933. Once in power, the Nazis created a mythology surrounding the rise to power, and they describe the period that roughly corresponds to the scope of this article as either the Kampfzeit or the Kampfjahren. The beginning, Hitler became involved with the fledgling Nazi Party after the First World War, and set the violent tone of the movement early, by forming the Sturmatialung paramilitary. Catholic Bavaria resented rule from Protestant Berlin, and Hitler at first saw revolution in Bavaria as a means to power but an early attempt proved fruitless, and he was imprisoned after the 1923 Munich beer hall putsch. He used the time to produce Mein Kampf, in which he argued that the effeminate Jewish-Christian ethic was enfeebling Europe, and that Germany needed a man of iron to restore itself and build an empire. He decided on the tactic of pursuing power through legal means. From armistice to party membership. After being granted permission from King Ludwig III of Bavaria, 25-year-old Austrian-born Hitler enlisted in a Bavarian regiment of the German army, although he was not yet a German citizen. For over 4 years, Germany was a principal belligerent in World War I, on the Western Front. Soon after the fighting on the front ended in November 1918, Hitler returned to Munich after the armistice with no job, no real civilian job skills and no friends. He remained in the Reichswehr and was given a relatively meaningless assignment during the winter of 1918–1919, but was eventually recruited by the Army's political department, possibly because of his assistance to the Army in investigating the responsibility for the ill-fated Bavarian Soviet Republic. He took part in national thinking courses under Captain Karl Mayer. Apparently his skills in oratory, as well as his extreme and open anti-Semitism, caught the eye of an approving army officer and he was promoted to an education officer which gave him an opportunity to speak in public. In July 1919 Hitler was appointed Verbindungsmann of an AUFKLA currency Runskommando of the Reichswehr, both to influence other soldiers and to infiltrate the German Workers' Party. The DAP had been formed by Anton Drexler, Karl Harrer and others, through amalgamation of other groups, on January 5, 1919 at a small gathering in Munich at the restaurant Fürstenfelder Hof. While he studied the activities of the DAP, Hitler became impressed with Drexler's anti-Semitic, nationalist, anti-capitalist and anti-Marxist ideas. During the 12 September 1919 meeting, Hitler took umbrage with comments made by an audience member that were directed against Gottfried Feder, The speaker, a crank economist with whom Hitler was acquainted due to a lecture Feder delivered in an army education course. The audience member asserted that Bavaria should be wholly independent from Germany and should secede from Germany and unite with Austria to form a new South German nation. The volatile Hitler arose and scolded the unfortunate Professor Baumann, using his astonishing speaking skills and eventually causing Baumann to leave the meeting before its adjournment. Impressed with Hitler's oratory skills, Drexler invited him to join the DAP. Hitler accepted on September 12, 1919, becoming the party's 55th member. In less than a week, Hitler received a postcard from Drexler stating he had officially been accepted as a DAP member and he should come to a committee meeting to discuss it. Hitler attended the committee meeting held at the rundown Alte Rosenbad beer house. Later Hitler wrote that joining the fledgling party was the most decisive resolve of my life. From here there was and could be no turning back. I registered as a member of the German Workers' Party and received a provisional membership card with a number 7 inches. Normally, enlisted army personnel were not allowed to join political parties. However, in this case, Hitler had Captain Mayer's permission to join the DAP. Further, Hitler was allowed to stay in the army and receive his weekly pay of 20 gold marks a week. Equals from early party membership to the Hofbrauhausmeile equals. By early 1920 the DAP had swelled to over 101 members, and Hitler received his membership card as member number 555. Hitler's considerable oratory and propaganda skills were appreciated by the party leadership. With the support of Anton Drexler, Hitler became chief of propaganda for the party in early 1920. In February 1920 he engineered the name change of the DAP to the Nationalsozialistische Deutsche Arbeiterpartei Euro NSDAP, commonly known to the rest of the world as the Nazi Party. Hitler designed the party's banner of a swastika in a white circle on a red background. His actions began to transform the party. He organized their biggest meeting yet of 2,000 people, on February 24, 1920 in the Saatliches Hofbra Currency in Mar 1/4 NCHEN. There Hitler announced the party's 25-point program. Hitler was later discharged from the army in March 1920 and began working full-time for the NSDAP. In August Hitler also organized a hall protection squad which later was known as the Gymnastics and Sports Division. The group was named at first the Ordnertruppen and it may well be that their principal intended purpose was, in fact, to keep order at Nazi meetings and to only suppress those who disrupted the Nazi meetings. In early October the group's name was officially changed to the Sturmabteilung or SA, which was certainly more descriptive and suggested the possibility of offensive, as well as solely defensive, action. Throughout 1920, Hitler began to lecture at Munich's beer halls, particularly the Hofbra Currencyhaus, Stenekebra Currency in Bar 1/4 Rugebra Currency Keller. Only Hitler was able to bring in the crowds for the party speeches and meetings. By this time, the police were already monitoring the speeches, and their own surviving records reveal that Hitler delivered lectures with titles such as Political Phenomenon, Jews and the Treaty of Versailles. At the end of the year, party membership was recorded at 2,000. In June 1921, while Hitler and Dietrich Eckart were on a fundraising trip to Berlin, a mutiny broke out within the NSDAP in Munich. Members of its executive committee wanted to merge with the rival German Socialist Party. Hitler returned to Munich on July 11 and angrily tendered his resignation. The committee members realized that the resignation of their leading public figure and speaker would mean the end of the party. Hitler announced he would rejoin on the condition that he would replace Drexler as party chairman, and that the party headquarters would remain in Munich. The committee agreed, and he rejoined the party on July 26 as member 3680. In the following days, Hitler spoke to several packed houses and defended himself, to thunderous applause. His strategy proved successful. At a general membership meeting, he was granted absolute powers as party chairman, with only one nay vote cast. On September 14, 1921, Hitler and a substantial number of SA members and other Nazi Party adherents disrupted a meeting at the Lowenbräu Keller of the Bavarian League. This federalist organization objected to the centralism of the Weimar Constitution, but accepted its social program. The League was led by Otto Ballestadt, an engineer whom Hitler regarded as my most dangerous opponent. One Nazi, Hermann Hesse, climbed upon a chair and shouted that the Jews were to blame for the misfortunes of Bavaria, and the Nazis shouted demands that Ballestadt yield the floor to Hitler. The Nazis beat up Ballestadt and shoved him off the stage into the audience. Both Hitler and Hesse were arrested, and Hitler commented notoriously to the police commissioner, "It's all right. We got what we wanted." Ballestadt did not speak. Hitler was eventually sentenced to 3 months imprisonment and ended up serving only a little over 1 month. On November 4, 1921, the Nazi Party held a large public meeting in the Munich Hofbräu Currency-House. After Hitler had spoken for some time, the meeting erupted into a melee in which a small company of SA defeated the opposition. From beer hall melee to beer hall coup d'état, the abortive beer hall putsch and the ensuing trial. In 1922 and early 1923, Hitler formed 2 organizations that would grow to have huge significance. The first was the Jungsturm und Jugendbund, which would later become the Hitler Youth. The other was the Staatswege, an early incarnation of what would later become the Schutzstaffel. Inspired by Benito Mussolini's March on Rome, Hitler decided that a coup d'état was the proper strategy to seize control of the country. In May 1923, elements loyal to Hitler within the army helped the SA to procure a barracks and its weaponry, but the order to march never came. A pivotal moment came when Hitler led the beer hall putsch, an attempted coup d'état on 8 November 9, 1923. 16 NSDAP members and 4 police officers were killed in the failed coup. Hitler was arrested on November 11, 1923. Hitler was put on trial for high treason, gaining great public attention. The rather spectacular trial began in February 1924. Hitler endeavored to turn the tables and put democracy and the Weimar Republic on trial as traitors to the German people. Hitler was convicted and on April 1 sentenced to 5 years imprisonment at Landsberg prison. Hitler received friendly treatment from the guards. He had a room with a view of the river, wore a tie, regular visitors to his chambers, was allowed mail from supporters and was permitted the use of a private secretary. The Bavarian Supreme Court issued a pardon and he was released from jail on December 20, 1924, against the state prosecutor's objections. Hitler used the time in Landsberg prison to consider his political strategy and dictate the first volume of Mein Kampf, principally to his loyal aide Rudolf Hess. After the putsch, the party was banned in Bavaria, but it participated in 1924's 2 elections by proxy as the National Socialist Freedom Movement. In the German election, May 1924, the party gained seats in the Reichstag, with 6.55% voting for the movement. In the German election, December 1924, the National Socialist Freedom Movement and the Nazi Party lost 18 seats, only holding on to 14 seats, with 3% of the electorate voting for Hitler's party. The Baumat scandal was often used later in Nazi propaganda, both as an electoral strategy and as an appeal to anti-Semitism. Hitler had determined, after some reflection, that power was to be achieved not through revolution outside of the government, but rather through legal means, within the confines of the democratic system established by Weimar. For 5 to 6 years there would be no further prohibitions of the party. Move towards power. In the German election, May 1928, the party achieved just 12 seats in the Reichstag. The highest provincial gain was again in Bavaria, though in 3 areas the NSDAP failed to gain even 1% of the vote. Overall, the NSDAP gained 2.63% of the vote. Partially due to the poor results, Hitler decided that Germans needed to know more about his goals. Despite being discouraged by his publisher, he wrote a second book that was discovered and released posthumously as the Zweitbuch. At this time the SA began a period of deliberate antagonism to the Root Front by marching into communist strongholds and starting violent altercations. At the end of 1928, party membership was recorded at 130,000. In March 1929, Erich Ludendorff represented the Nazi Party in the presidential elections. He gained 280,000 votes, and was the only candidate to poll fewer than 1 million votes. The battles on the streets grew increasingly violent. After the Rote Front interrupted a speech by Hitler, the SA marched into the streets of Nuremberg and killed 2 bystanders. In a tit-for-tat action, the SA stormed a Rote Front meeting on August 25 and days later the Berlin headquarters of the Communist Party of Germany itself. In September Goebbels led his men into Neuker Paragraph LLN, a KPD stronghold, and the 2 warring parties exchanged pistol and revolver fire. The German referendum of 1929 was important as it gained the Nazi Party recognition and credibility it never had before. On the evening of January 14, 1930, at around 10 o'clock, Horst Wessel was shot at point-blank range in the face by 2 members of the KPD in Friedrichshain. It led to fatal consequences. The attack occurred after an argument with his landlady who was a member of the KPD, and contacted one of her Rote Front friends, Albert Hochter, who shot Wessel. Wessel had penned a song months before which would become a Nazi anthem as the Horst Wessel lied. Goebbels seized upon the attack to publicize the song, and the funeral was used as an anti-communist propaganda opportunity for the Nazis. On April 1 Hanover enacted a law banning the Hitlerjugend, and Goebbels was convicted of high treason at the end of May. Bavaria banned all political uniforms on June 2, and on June 11 Prussia prohibited the wearing of SA brown shirts and associated insignia. The next month Prussia passed a law against its officials holding membership in either the NSDAP or KPD. Later in July, Goebbels was again tried, this time for public insult, and fined. The government also placed the army officers on trial for forming National Socialist cells. Against this violent backdrop, Hitler's party gained a shocking victory in the Reichstag, obtaining 107 seats. The Nazis became the second largest party in Germany. In Bavaria the party gained 17.9% of the vote, though for the first time this percentage was exceeded by most other provinces: Oldenburg, Braunschweig, Waldeck, Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Lippe-Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Anhalt, Thuringen, Baden, Hamburg, Prussia, Hessen, Sachsen, Lübeck and Schoenberg-Lippe. An unprecedented amount of money was thrown behind the campaign. Well over 1 million pamphlets were produced and distributed. 60 trucks were commandeered for use in Berlin alone. In areas where NSDAP campaigning was less rigorous, the total was as low as 9%. The Great Depression was also a factor in Hitler's electoral success. Against this legal backdrop, the SA began its first major anti-Jewish action on October 13, 1930 when groups of brown shirts smashed the windows of Jewish-owned stores at Potsdamer Platz. Weimar parties failed to halt Nazis. The Wall Street crash of 1929 heralded worldwide economic disaster. The Nazis and the Communists made great gains at the 1930 election. Both the Nazis and Communists were pledged to eliminating democracy, but between them secured over 50% of Reichstag seats, requiring the moderate parties to consider negotiations with anti-democrats. The Communists, wrote Bullock, openly announced that they would prefer to see the Nazis in power rather than lift a finger to save the Republic. The Weimar political parties failed to stop the Nazi rise. Germany's Weimar political system made it difficult for chancellors to govern with a stable parliamentary majority, and successive chancellors instead relied on the president's emergency powers to govern. From 1931 to 1933, the Nazis combined terror tactics with conventional campaigning. Hitler crisscrossed the nation by air, while SA troops paraded in the streets, beat up opponents, and broke up their meetings. A middle-class Liberal Party strong enough to block the Nazis did not exist. The People's Party and the Democrats suffered severe losses to the Nazis at the polls. The Social Democrats were essentially a conservative trade union party, with ineffectual leadership. The Catholic Centre Party maintained its voting bloc, but was preoccupied with defending its own particular interests and, wrote Bullock, through 1932-3. was so far from recognizing the danger of a Nazi dictatorship that it continued to negotiate with the Nazis. The Communists meanwhile were engaging in violent clashes with Nazis on the streets, but Moscow had directed the Communist Party to prioritize destruction of the Social Democrats, seeing more danger in them as a rival for the loyalty of the working class. Nevertheless, wrote Bullock, the heaviest responsibility lay with the German right, who forsook a true conservatism, and made Hitler their partner in a coalition government. The Centre Party's Heinrich Braun-Courtening was Chancellor from 1930 to 1932. Braun-Courtening and Hitler were unable to reach terms of cooperation, but Braun-Courtening himself increasingly governed with the support of the President and army over that of the Parliament. The 84-year-old President von Hindenburg, a conservative monarchist, was reluctant to take action to suppress the Nazis, while the ambitious Major General Kurt von Schleicher, as minister handling army and navy matters, hoped to harness their support. With Schleicher's backing, and Hitler's stated approval, Hindenburg appointed the Catholic monarchist Franz von Papen to replace Braun-Courtening as Chancellor in June 1932. Papen had been active in the resurgence of the Habsburg Front. He had fallen out with the Centre Party. He hoped ultimately to outmaneuver Hitler. At the July 1932 elections, the Nazis became the largest party in the Reichstag and Hitler withdrew support for Papen, and demanded the chancellorship. He was refused by Hindenburg. Papen dissolved parliament, and the Nazi vote declined at the November election. In the aftermath of the election, Papen proposed ruling by decree while drafting a new electoral system, with an upper house. Schleicher convinced Hindenburg to sack Papen, and Schleicher himself became Chancellor, promising to form a workable coalition. The aggrieved Papen opened negotiations with Hitler, proposing a Nazi nationalist coalition. Having nearly outmaneuvered Hitler, only to be trounced by Schleicher, Papen turned his attentions on defeating Schleicher, and concluded an agreement with Hitler. Seizure of control, on March 10, 1931, with street violence between the Rote Front and SA spiraling out of control, breaking all previous barriers and expectations, Prussia reenacted its ban on brown shirts. Days after the ban, SA men shot dead 2 communists in a street fight, which led to a ban being placed on the public speaking of Goebbels, who sidestepped the prohibition by recording speeches and playing them to an audience in his absence. Ernst Rauh paragraph HM, in charge of the SA, put Count Micha von Hildorf, a convicted murderer and vehement anti-Semite, in charge of the Berlin SA. The deaths mounted up, with many more on the Rote Front side, and by the end of 1931 the SA suffered 47 deaths, and the Rote Front recorded losses of approximately 80. Street fights and beer hall battles resulting in deaths occurred throughout February and April 1932, all against the backdrop of Adolf Hitler's competition in the presidential election, which pitted him against the monumentally popular Hindenburg. In the first round on March 13, Hitler had polled over 11 million votes but was still behind Hindenburg. The second and final round took place on April 10. Hitler lost out to Paul von Hindenburg whilst KPD candidate the currency LMANN gained a meager percentage of the vote. At this time, the Nazi Party had just over 800,000 card-carrying members. 3 days after the presidential elections, the German government banned the NSDAP paramilitaries, the SA and the SS, on the basis of the emergency decree for the preservation of state authority. This action was largely prompted by details which emerged at a trial of SA men for assaulting unarmed Jews in Berlin. After less than a month, the law was repealed by Franz von Papen, Chancellor of Germany, on May 30. Such ambivalence about the fate of Jews was supported by the culture of anti-Semitism that pervaded the German public at the time. Dwarfed by Hitler's electoral gains, the KPD turned away from legal means and increasingly towards violence. One resulting battle in Silesia resulted in the army being dispatched, each shot sending Germany further into a potential all-out civil war. By this time both sides marched into each other's strongholds hoping to spark rivalry. Hermann Gar paragraph Ring, as Speaker of the Reichstag, asked the Papen government to prosecute shooters. Laws were then passed which made political violence a capital crime. The attacks continued, and reached fever pitch when SA Storm leader Axel Schofield was assassinated. At the end of July, The Nazi Party gained almost 14 million votes, securing 230 seats in the Reichstag. Energized by the incredible results, Hitler asked to be made Chancellor. Papen offered the position of Vice-Chancellor, but Hitler refused. Hermann Gar paragraph Ring, in his position of Reichstag President, asked that decisive measures be taken by the government over the Spaten murders of National Socialists. On August 9, amendments were made to the Reichsstrafgesetzbuch statute on acts of political violence, increasing the penalty to lifetime imprisonment, 20 years hard labor or death. Special courts were announced to try such offenses. When in power less than half a year later, Hitler would use this legislation against his opponents with devastating effect. The law was applied almost immediately, but did not bring the perpetrators behind the recent massacres to trial as expected. Instead, 5 SA men who were alleged to have murdered a KPD member in Potempa were tried. Adolf Hitler appeared at the trial as a defense witness, but on August 22 the 5 were convicted and sentenced to death. On appeal, this sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in early September. They would serve just over 4 months before Hitler freed all imprisoned Nazis in a 1933 amnesty. The Nazi Party lost 35 seats in the November 1932 election, but remained the Reichstag's largest party, with 196 seats. The Social Democrats won 121 seats and the Communists won 100. The Comintern described all moderate left-wing parties as social fascists, and urged the Communists to devote their energies to the destruction of the moderate left. As a result, the KPD, following orders from Moscow, rejected overtures from the Social Democrats to form a political alliance against the NSDAP. After Chancellor Papen left office, he secretly told Hitler that he still held considerable sway with President Hindenburg and that he would make Hitler Chancellor as long as he, Papen, could be the Vice-Chancellor. Hindenburg appointed Hitler as Chancellor on January 30, 1933, in a coalition arrangement between the Nazis and the nationalist conservatives. Papen was to serve as Vice-Chancellor in a majority conservative cabinet, still falsely believing that he could tame Hitler. Initially, Papen did speak out against some Nazi excesses, and only narrowly escaped death in the Night of the Long Knives, whereafter he ceased to openly criticize the regime. On January 30, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of a coalition government of the NSDAP-DNVP party. The SA and SS led torchlight parades throughout Berlin. In the coalition government, 3 members of the cabinet were Nazis: Hitler, Wilhelm Frick and Hermann Gar paragraph Ring. With Germans who opposed Nazism failing to unite against it, Hitler soon moved to consolidate absolute power. Chancellor to dictator. Following the Reichstag fire, the Nazis began to suspend civil liberties and eliminate political opposition. The Communists were excluded from the Reichstag. At the March 1933 elections, again no single party secured a majority. Hitler required the vote of the Centre Party and conservatives in the Reichstag to obtain the powers he desired. He called on Reichstag members to vote for the Enabling Act on March 24, 1933. Hitler was granted plenary powers temporarily by the passage of the Act. The law gave him the freedom to act without parliamentary consent and even without constitutional limitations. Employing his characteristic mix of negotiation and intimidation, Hitler offered the possibility of friendly cooperation, promising not to threaten the Reichstag, the president, the states or the churches if granted the emergency powers. With Nazi paramilitary encircling the building, he said, "It is for you, gentlemen of the Reichstag, to decide between war and peace." The Centre Party, having obtained promises of non-interference in religion, joined with conservatives in voting for the Act. The Act allowed Hitler and his cabinet to rule by emergency decree for 4 years, though Hindenburg remained president. Hitler immediately set about abolishing the powers of the states and the existence of non-Nazi political parties and organizations. Non-Nazi parties were formally outlawed on July 14, and the Reichstag abdicated its democratic responsibilities. The Act did not infringe upon the powers of the president, and Hitler would not fully achieve full dictatorial power until after the death of Hindenburg in August 1934. Hindenburg remained commander-in-chief of the military and retained the power to negotiate foreign treaties. See also, early timeline of Nazism, Gleitschaltung, Machtergreifung, Night of the Long Knives, Poison Kitchen, Political views of Adolf Hitler, Weimar paramilitary groups, Weimar political parties. References. Footnotes notes citations External links, Hitler becomes Chancellor. Original reports from The Times.